Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the head of marketing at Infotools. Today, we're joined by Steve Mossop, Executive Vice President of Leger Vancouver, and leads a team of 25 plus researchers in BC, serving public and private sector clients with full service market research solutions. Leger is Canada's largest and best known public opinion polling firm. Before this, Steve was president of Insights West, who Leger acquired in late 2021. And prior to this, Steve was at Ipsos for 17 years, managing 30 plus client service staff in multiple cities after starting his career at the Angus Reid Group and TNS in early years. And what might give away what we're going to be talking about today, Steve has impressively correctly predicted the outcomes of 25 elections over his career. For those of you who have listened to one of our previous podcasts with John Jerusai, you'll know how complex this can be, especially in these modern times. Thanks for joining us on the show today, Steve.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. So, Steve, what's the most significant thing you wanted to share with us today?
Really, it's the importance of election polling. Why do public opinion polling companies do it? And what are the pitfalls and maybe the upsides of it? And if I can share a little bit of history in that, and hopefully that's enlightening to your readers.
Sure thing. So to give a little bit of a background for today's episode, how did you get into election polling?
I was one of these rare cases where I've been in the business of polling since I was in my senior year in high school. And I took on this job, and it was back in the days when telephone interviewing was still quite popular, and there was still a big contingent of door to door. So I had spent a summer in the mailroom, and my job was to send out product samples across the nation of during the Coca-Cola wars, when there was the Pepsi and Coke challenge. And you might famously remember the story, if you studied marketing, or anybody that studied marketing, is the big fail of the new Coca-Cola. And I like to feel like I was part of that story, because the organization I was working for was sending out these product samples and testing A, B versus C, D over a period of months and months and months. And it tweaked my curiosity, because the question that was asked in that, essentially a public opinion poll, is what tastes better? A, B, C, D, these privately labeled, not privately labeled, but proto-monetically labeled testing. And it turns out that, the answer was delivered, and Coca-Cola made the biggest mistake ever by changing their formulation without any other consideration. And that inspired me over the years as a story to repeat, because they didn't ask the right question. So it tweaked my interest, and since then I've been involved in tons and tons of public affairs research projects. I've personally been responsible for over 1,000 public releases on every topic under the sun, but the political ones always capture the interest of readers as well as news outlets. So it's been an area of passion of mine for quite some time, ever since that day.
Fascinating. So that whole blind taste testing got piqued a question in me. What would happen if we were to blind taste test politicians and parties? So if we were to remove the people and the branding from it, do you think we'd be seeing some different results from election day?
Michael, that's an excellent point, because really it shows the power of association with the brand or without a brand, and the two go hand in hand. It's almost impossible to you think of the old days of university, when the marketing folks would go out and do blind taste tests of beer to prove the point that you don't even know what beer you actually like. You're driven by the marketing and the packaging around it. So absolutely, I think it would impact election polling. You can't really disassociate the two, though.
No, for sure. So you can understand why media outlets undertake election polling, as they can report on it and have stories, etc., understanding where people are at. But what about companies? Do they do election polling? And can you explain perhaps why they do, if they do?
Well, at the higher level, you'd like to think as a company and as in worldwide election polling, that it serves as a litmus test for the other work that you do. So if you can predict elections accurately, then certainly you can predict things like market share, public opinion on other things. product selection, all those variables that we stand behind as a market research industry. So I think it serves that purpose. But selfishly speaking, not just from Leger's point of view, but from my own personal point of view, it's a great brand builder. I mean, the value of unpaid media is just too luring for any organization in any country for that matter. And you could be, behind the scenes working privately for clients for years and do one election poll, and all of a sudden your brand recognition just goes through the roof due to, whether you won it or lost it or succeeded or didn't succeed. So the lure is tempting, and that's why you see this proliferation of polls. And I know ESMR published something a couple of years back, I think just before the pandemic, that showed that out of 5,000 election polls around the world, that they are actually, despite popular opinion, they're extremely accurate, that we've done as an industry an exceptional job in measuring public opinion around the world and predicting future elections, which buys all the companies that have done it that ever so valuable media time.
So why do you think there's the difference of opinion versus the actually effectiveness of the polls then? What's that delta down to?
Well, there's so many factors that go into accurately predicting an election poll. And I think you use the example that I'm working within right now. Typically companies that have their own panels do better than those that don't. And that's because you know what the composition of the people that respond to those surveys. And within that framework, there are companies who do better than others based on how well they're known. So if you look worldwide, Ipsos is a powerful brand. In Canada, Angus, Reid is a powerful brand. Certainly Leger is an extremely powerful brand. And what happens in those cases, those companies elicit responses from public in joining panels because they want to be part of something. They want to, they see a poll in the news and they say, oh, I want to be part of that. I think that's an interesting survey. I recognize the brand, there's trust there, so I joined the panel. And when that happens, you have this magic sauce of brand recognition, participation rates. And so you can build these robust panels that are super representative and tend to do a much better job than the companies that do less on the branding front.
I mean, one of the biggest issues that we've got in New Zealand is I think only around 30% of people actually vote. Like, it's quite low, like significantly low. And is that similar to what you'd expect from election polling or polling prior as well?
It is, voter turnout it gets tricky, especially at that level. We have a similar issue in Canada at the municipal level. So if you're voting for the mayor of your city, typically an election turnout might be, good turnout might be 35%. In the federal polls, it's higher, it's 65 or 66, depending on the year and so on. In other countries, look at Australia, how well they do because it's mandatory, but other countries suffer from the same thing. So the less participation, the more difficult it is to predict. One of the magic elixirs, if you will, within Leger is that when you get into those elections that don't have a high participation rate, we ask respondents the question, do you know what day election day is? So it might be 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before. If they know what day election day is, it's the single biggest predictor of them actually showing up and casting a ballot. And so we tend to fall back on that when we need to do those elections where the turnout might be lower than usual.
Interesting. So elections have often been referred to as the zeitgeist of public opinion. Do you think this will always be the case, or do you think we're moving into a time where something else might take that mantle?
I think it's always going to hold its place. It's just, as I say, the temptation is too high. The opportunity for free publicity, free press is too high. I think it's always going to be there. I can't envision a time where it's not.
So are there any key stories that stand out in election polling that you've learned throughout your experience?
Well, there's tons, and I'll refer to a couple of them. I'll talk first about my own local experience. That was a bit of a game changer. And then I'll talk a little bit about the USA, which the eyes of the world is constantly on because of their failure in the last at least 2 elections to predict accurately. So in the first case, it was going back to 2012, and it was a local election here in British Columbia. And the pollster, I had just started my company about 8 months prior to that. And so we had assembled a small panel. We did our first poll, and then we kind of got scared. We didn't want to put our brand name out there as being one of those pollsters that hung everything on the election results because we were too early. So we stopped polling. But every pollster got it wrong. I mean, everyone, 15 different companies that had polled, including Leger at the time, Ipsos, everybody got it dead wrong. And what happens in some elections, the more exciting ones, is things can change very quickly. And we rely on margin of error, which usually, is a few percentage points. But in this particular case, there was a massive shift in sentiment towards one of the leaders. And the pollsters were out like 5 to 8 points, and they actually got the winner wrong, which is even more devastating. It's one thing to be beyond the margin of error, but if you get the winner wrong, then it's mea culpa. You're really scrambling to explain yourself. So in this particular instance, the poll results were off, and we did a post-election poll, an exit poll the day of and the day after. And what we found is that 15% of people decided in the past 24 hours which way they were going to vote. And that's very unusual in any campaign anywhere in the world, that in that last minute second, somebody's walking up to the polling station and deciding. And that swayed the vote. But if you're not asking, going back to the Coca-Cola story, if you're not asking the right questions, if you hadn't looked at voter certainty, how certain they are to vote for the candidate the day of election day, and if you haven't looked at if they're not certain, where are they leaning towards, those kinds of questions, if you miss them, can really be problematic when you have a last minute change in behavior. So that's one example. And it stood out to me as something that I'll never forget. So whenever I do election polling now, I'm really careful about the strength of the vote by which party, and also what would prompt change, and if they do change, where they would lean, and always to map it out and be certain that where last minute changes could occur. The second thing that can happen is when you get small segments of people who sway the vote. And in America's example, it's really the rural, white, uneducated voter. And it's a fairly small segment when it comes to overall population, but it's quite a large segment when it comes to supporting the Republican Party. And around the world, panels are notoriously bad for getting the opinions of young white male voters or consumers, for that matter. So it's a segment that drove the election outcome in America. And because it's dramatically underrepresented, especially right-wing thinking young male voters, and particularly uneducated young white male voters, that if your panels aren't accounting for that, you have these 3 or 4 percentage swings that happen in the USA, where again, like 90% of the pollsters got it wrong. Leger, luckily, maybe, or maybe skillfully, got it right, but you can miss in instances like that. And there's lots of election results around the world where, especially in the UK and other places I can think of, in France, where if you can sway a particular voter segment, for example, youth, if you can really get the youth to show up in any big numbers, and you're missing those in the panel, or you're missing representation, or not as good as what you can miss voter turnout and therefore election calls based on those fringe voter elements that can sway elections. So those are my two biggest lessons, is last minute changes, and then fringe voter segments that can overturn what sort of mainstream election results are more predictable and telling.
So what kind of things can be done to try and fill the gaps when you are missing that representation then?
Well, in the early days, and we don't do, most people that cover elections, they don't do it in singular instances. It's usually a tracking, and you measure the campaign from the call of the campaign, or even before that to the end. So it could be a month to a 2-month process, depending on where in the world you're polling. And in those instances, you have to be aware of those nuances. Where is the support coming from for different parties, and especially ones that are non-traditional? Or even the case, women voters in a certain age group, they can drive election results. And I can't recall in recent memory where I've seen that specifically, but if you don't have your finger on the pulse of where that support is coming from, and if it's not the mainstream typical voters that are showing up, then you need to make sure that you're in subsequent polls tracking that, and really making sure your panel quality is there to actually be able to track it.
So, I mean, you briefly touched on it before, but are there any other reasons why you think USA polling companies may have failed in the last couple of elections?
Yes, there is another major factor, and this was a topic of heavy debate at the Canadian Research Insights Council meeting just a few weeks ago in Toronto, which is our national association for polling standards across the country. And AI has an influence on this as well, but the quality of panels is a constant issue of deterioration in many parts of the world. And, we had the heydays of building panels fairly easily with, the different privacy laws and rising costs of social media. What's happened, not only costs have increased, but you're getting bots. So we're getting places that are trying to subscribe and fill in surveys to collect reward points and earn prizes or cash. And that's an ongoing issue. The USA is particularly bad right now. The quality of panel sample providers in the USA, I would say, is at an all-time low. And it's a very difficult problem to crack. It's not a single solution problem. But we've had surveys even recently where we're screening out up to 20% or 25% of the respondents from well-established brand name panels across the world that operate in the US, but they're getting filled with people that are not who they say they are. So that is a major issue and a major contributor to election misses in public polling in the States.
So you think one way to tackle this is having a mix of methodologies, in person, online, and then would you weight those accordingly as well?
I'm not sure I'd weight them, but most panel providers, especially in the States, have a one method solution, and that is affiliate networks. And what that means is, we're asking people to participate in panels. We're not really knowing the source of it because it's all, it's 3 or 4 steps removed from the actual research company. So if you actually ask people, where did your panel come from? They can't really answer it. And with that, knowing that, if you don't really have a handle on where your panelists are coming from, that is a contributor to the problem. Because who knows, maybe you're getting them all from, not to pick on a particular game, but maybe you're getting them all from Words with Friends players, or you're getting them all from a certain gamification that has a certain demographic skew that is not really representative. And if you don't have a way of knowing where your people are coming from, that is a big contributor to the problem.
So what do companies need to do to more accurately predict election results?
Well, track records are important, as I've already commented, but I think quality of panel is really at the heart of it. And, as I said, companies with their own panels tend to have an advantage because they can do all their homework. They can do bot removals. They can do things like speeders and weeding out people who have inconsistent answers. They can look at demographic profiles. They can look at IP addresses. There's lots of quality control measures that we can do in an organization that is running your own panel. When you have externally bought panel sources, that becomes more difficult. You could ask your secondhand provider to do that, but you don't have your finger on the pulse of what quality control issues may or may not exist. So I'd say that's the single biggest thing, is getting a handle on panel quality is top of the list. Secondly, you have to have the people with political know-how. You don't just run an election poll and have, a CPG expert in the industry kind of winging it. You have to have political experts internally who know the nuances of voter behavior, that know the nuances of election turnouts and the segments that are knowing the right questions to ask. Going back to the Coca-Cola example earlier, you have to know the right questions to ask. So you need the experts. So that's probably the second biggest area, is having the expertise internally to have election polling experts that really know what they're doing.
What mutual lessons do you think the public and consumer researchers are learning from each other to try and lift the games on both sides?
Well, yeah, we're constantly monitoring our own competitors in this and watching where they're making predictions, how things are changing over time. So we kind of follow each other for that, for the benefit of the polling industry as a whole. We're watching where failures occur. We're watching, for example, the successes and or failures of IVR-based polling. Does that work in different countries, and measuring that success, both anecdotally and also tracking it. So the peer pressure is really there. And I think that's probably the strongest really motivator for bettering the polling industry, is knowing that all your peers are watching. And in Canada, we have a couple of what I would call collector sites, where they measure all the opinion polls that are done in elections, and they measure their success, plot it and track it, and then grade the pollsters. Luckily, or maybe not luckily for us, we're rated an AAA public opinion polling company in Canada because of our track record. But those kinds of things help. Peer pressure is absolutely critical to making it all work.
Well, and no one sets out to not succeed in this area, do they? So it's not for lack of trying or resolve.
Mm-hmm.
So Leisure, as you mentioned, holds the distinction of being Canada's most accurate polling company. How have you achieved this? What are you doing differently?
Well, it starts with a good panel, and owning your own panel source is critical. So we've had many years of building that, starting with an organic build. If we used to recruit people by telephone to our panel online, but using, as you referred to earlier, multiple sources. So it's not just all affiliate networks buying, but they're like, probably 24 different methods of getting people to join our panel. Having brand recognition is key. I came across a stat just about a month ago that said Leger is responsible for about 40% of all publicly released opinion polls in this country, which is unheard of. Maybe in the days of Gallup, in the early days of US polling, you might have seen that number, but that's pretty rare to have. So in countries where you have a brand that's so dominant as ours, that's really helpful, because you start to attract people that normally wouldn't participate in opinion polls. And then secondly, having the technology behind your platforms to be able to do automatic weeding out of bots, speeders, fraudulent respondents is also pretty key on the list. And then lastly, having the know-how. You need to have, John Mark himself has been in the industry with that background since he started the company in 1996, and having that experience, there's no substitute for it. So I think it's I don't know if that's 3 or 4 points I've made, Michael, but it's there's a collection of things that have helped with our success here in Canada.
Yeah, sure. And owning your panel, I guess you would have been able to see some changes in sentiment and public opinion throughout those times as well. So you know who's voting when and like how those are changing across time.
Yeah, we have nationally, I believe it's almost monthly, where we're tracking that sentiment. So we don't just wait for election time to spot trends and where things are going. We have our finger on the pulse throughout, and having that tracking ability and knowing not just the what we call the horse race, who people are voting for, but understanding what drives and makes up loyalty to each political party. If you know that, and then you have your finger on the pulse of election issues that are rising or falling, or candidates that are talking about, you kind of have a sense of where the popular vote's going to go and what segments they're going to attract to their platform. And so having that intimate knowledge of the consumer, and in this case the political consumer, is essential to getting it right.
Sure. And so when you work with companies as well, when they've got their own database or sample panel, their customers, do you marry those up there and you get to see some of the similar kinds of patterns and trends?
Absolutely, and it's quite critical, even a company of our size, and any company for that matter in the world. When you're doing a public opinion poll, it's usually a blended sample of not just our panel but other panel providers, because you get into those micro regions. If you pick a particular city, even in your country, and look at what's required to get a sample of 2,000 people in any one particular city, well, you need to go to multiple providers to get that done. And it's not different here. So we're constantly evaluating, using different suppliers, and tracking things like past voter behavior. And that's a good, if we can track, and that's an easy one, what political party did you vote for in the last election, and you match it up to the actual records in a provincial or particular jurisdiction, right away whether the panel is accurate or not. So we're constantly looking at that to make sure that we're partnering with providers who are doing a good job in keeping their panel fresh and representative.
Yeah, sure. So lastly, there's been a lot of talk about AI in the world of late, much of it negative at that as well. So what positive impact do you think AI will have on polling and elections in the future?
Michael, I can't let you get away with just without one comment on the negative. And that is, I talked about the advancement of bots and fraudulent data. I think AI is going to make that even more of a challenge, because in even just a manual process, you can imagine if somebody is operating a sweatshop somewhere, and they're having multiple IP addresses join a panel, you can manually detect that. You can, because they're not that smart. They tend to do the same kinds of errors, and you can catch those. With AI, as smart as it is, you'll have an inability to catch it. You'll have smarter responses. You won't have speeders. You won't have people doing inconsistent answers, because AI is smarter than that. And so that makes it a big challenge on panel quality around the world. And I think that's probably going to arise as the single biggest issue in our panel side of our industry in the years to come, is how do you stay ahead of the curve and do that. On the positive side, I mean, I agree, there's been a lot of negative sentiment around AI. And in fact, we did a poll in Canada twice, once in February, once in May, and we found a 15-point drop in sentiment. And the sentiment question is, do you think AI is good for society or bad for society? And the last recording, it was at 39%. So it went from 24 or something, or 25 to 39% that think it's bad for society. So that negativity is pervasive in public opinion. And I would think it would be replicated in other countries. But that being said, there's lots of positives. I mean, we're finding significant advantages to AI in our business, everything from coding to helping with questionnaire design to helping analyze data, helping get, the stuff that you do in your company, getting reports and getting data and graphics into a state that's quicker and faster than normal. So we're making tremendous leaps just based on the AI advances, even in the last 6 months. So I think it's a positive thing overall. Maybe the interesting one that will come up, and I've heard talked about in the various conferences that I've spoken about AI at. So here's an interesting thing. So just in our company alone, we do 3,000 surveys per year. And you can imagine 3,000 surveys, 3,000 projects, I should say, times whatever sample size it is per year. So, over time, millions and millions of surveys that we do in a given year. And that's just us. So if we could collectively put all of that into some magic AI bucket, which theoretically is very possible, and we added every competitor to that mix, what I've been hearing is that in theory, we might be able to get to the point with a predictive model that says you don't actually need to do a public opinion poll. You can just plug in the questions, and AI will predict based on all of that data and all those nuances and the differences between age and gender and region on a million different public opinion polling subjects, and get to the point where you can design a survey, throw it into an AI algorithm, and without doing a poll, it'll predict what the poll would be. And I think at some point, I'm not a futuristic expert, but I think at some time in the future, whether it's a year from now, 2 years from now, or maybe less, we may get to that point. And in the early days, it might serve as a good proxy to, hey, let's just do a sensibility check. Let's check what the AI model spits out as what could be the public opinion poll results. But what if it gets to the point where it's actually as good as the actual opinion poll? And it's kind of a theoretical question, but a scary thought. Like, what if it's so smart that in the future you can plug in a question: what percentage of New Zealanders support or oppose, pick any public policy initiative in your country? And the AI model can say, well, based on 100,000 other public opinion polls around the world and differences between those groups that I talked about, it can actually predict what the actual percentage of people who strongly support a particular initiative. Then it raises a kind of a bigger question of, well, then what? What do we do? What are we going to do in the future when that day comes that we have AI doing at least as good of a job as the actual survey itself would do? So that's the interesting proposition. And hopefully at that point, Michael, I'm on a beach in Mexico, not worrying about that, but hopefully it's further off in the future than what we tend to think.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of talk, just musing really, around a respondentless future of market research and what the implications of that would be, and is it something we want to intentionally build towards, or do we want to make sure that people are still center of what we're doing, and different streams of thoughts on that one around the world. But yeah, I like the idea
Yeah.
of humans working with humans and being assisted by AI anyway, but not letting it drive too much.
I think we all like to think that we still have control over our future. And when that day, if that day ever came where AI can do a better job than we can do ourselves, then it almost makes you question our own free will. It's like, do we really have control and self driven, what's the word? Control of our destiny is I guess where it would lead to.
Yes. So if I can recap what we've talked about today, Steve. So essentially, public opinion and polling, etc. There is a big future for it. It's always going to be a need in society, and there have been some challenges that we've faced as an industry. But if we do ensure we reach those hard to reach people groups that can potentially sway overall elections, we can try and feed them into our predictions of what's going to happen as well, and so we can get a better sense of what the outcomes could be. We look at tidying up our data and our samples as much as we can, and there's a real importance of knowing who your sample is. And so, but the team at Leger obviously have their own panel and have done quite successfully of recent as well. Steve, you talked a little bit about some stories that you've learnt throughout your years in election polling. So thank you for sharing those. Commented a little bit about on the USA elections as well, and why some had failed there. You talked about a few things to help us predict elections more accurately. And we delved into a little bit of the world of AI and what role that could play in helping us to understand what people are thinking where, which again can help us to predict what future elections may take place. And the benefit of that obviously is companies, organizations, governments, etc., can plan for that and understand what they need to do and respond to those polls as well. I think that covered it. Not quite as elegantly as you had shared. Sorry, Steve. But
Well,
anything else?
you're a good listener because you did cover all those main elements and the impact of potential AI in the future. That's the last thing we talked about. But I'll refer back to that study that Isomar did a few years ago, and I'm sure it's been updated since then. And when I saw that cross my desk and saw the evidence that there of the 5,000 studies that have been done worldwide and the overall accuracy, that was like one of those moments when I said, wow, that we are doing something right. And, we're not an industry with large advertising budgets by any stretch. And, even very few professionals probably even remember that study. But that stood out to me as like a aha moment of we are doing it right. And we should be proud of that as an industry. And we shouldn't hesitate to bring the results of that out for any of the detractors and any of the naysayers that critique the industry and say what a terrible job that we do when there is a failure. Overall, it's an amazing track record, and it gives our clients around the world confidence in our data collection abilities and our abilities to understand consumers and consumer behavior. So I don't hesitate to bring that up and point it out to anyone who will listen that we've done a good job. We should congratulate ourselves on that.
Sure, and I'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes as well for anyone interested to check it out. So very, very good point you raised.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for having me on this program, and thanks to our audience for listening.
That's right. So thank you so much, Steve. So, and yes, if you have heard and liked what you listened to today, please feel free to share the podcast or subscribe to it as well. Leave a review, check out other episodes. We'd be very grateful for that. So thank you for listening to Now That's Significant.